The cold was a discipline. Caleb understood it, respected it. Here, in the high spine of the Colorado Rockies, winter was not a season, but a state of being, a constant pressure that demanded order and vigilance. His cabin, a small defiant structure of dark timber and stone, was his forward operating base against the wilderness outside and the one that raged within. Each morning began before the sun, with the sharp crack of wood splitting under his axe, the rhythmic scrape of the shovel clearing a path to the woodpile, the precise ritual of brewing coffee that was more ash than bean. It was a life stripped down to its essential components, a fortress built of routine. For a man who had spent 2 decades as a Navy SEAL, routine was the only bulwark against chaos. Inside, the cabin was as Spartan as a barracks. The floorboards were swept clean, the single wool blanket on his cot was folded with geometric precision, and the few books on the shelf were aligned by height. There were no photographs, no mementos, nothing that could serve as a beachhead for a memory to launch an assault. The ghosts were there, of course. They occupied the empty space beside him at the small table, the silence where a laugh should have been, the hollow in the air where a loyal head once rested on his knee. Sarah, with her eyes the color of a summer sky and a smile that could melt the permafrost in his soul. Rex, his partner, his shadow, a Belgian Malinois whose courage had been a steady flame in the dark hell of Afghanistan. The grief for them was a minefield he navigated every day, stepping carefully around the triggers, deactivating the emotional tripwires with the cold, hard tool of discipline. His sister Jessica called once a week. Her voice, tinny and distant, over the satellite phone, was a well-intentioned intrusion. She would ask if he was eating, if he was sleeping, if he had seen another human being. He would answer with clipped, monosyllabic reports, affirmative, negative, situation nominal. He knew she worried. He knew she saw his retreat into the mountains, not as a strategic withdrawal, but as a surrender. She did not understand that this silence, this cold, this isolation, was his mission now, the objective, to feel nothing. He was holding the line against the overwhelming force of his own heart. The internal winter had set in, and he had no intention of letting it thaw. The trip into town was a necessary evil, a tactical resupply run he undertook only when his stores ran critically low. He drove his old Ford truck down the winding mountain pass, the tires crunching on the salted gravel. The sky was the color of slate, heavy with the promise of a storm that the Weather Service had named with theatrical flair a winter bomb cyclone. To Caleb, it was just weather, another variable to be managed. The town of Havenwood was a small collection of buildings huddled in the valley, its windows glowing with a warmth that felt alien and unearned. He parked in his usual spot at the far end of the general store's lot, away from the other vehicles, minimizing contact. That was when he first saw her, a German shepherd, standing near the edge of the woods that bordered the parking lot. She was lean, her coat a patchwork of black and tan matted with burrs and snow. She was not begging, not scavenging. She was simply standing there, motionless as a statue, her amber eyes fixed on his truck. There was a stillness about her, a profound dignity that seemed at odds with her desperate condition. Most strays he encountered were skittish, a frantic bundle of nerves and hunger. This one was different. She held his gaze with an intelligence that felt unnervingly human, a silent communication that passed between them across the frozen asphalt. Caleb went inside, his mind processing the image. He moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency, grabbing flour, salt, coffee, kerosene. The store was warm, filled with the scent of cinnamon from a potpourri burner and the low murmur of conversation. He ignored it all, a ghost in a world of the living. At the checkout, Martha, the store's owner, gave him her usual kind, knowing smile. She was a small woman in her 70s, with silver hair and eyes that had seen too many winters. "Big storm coming, Caleb," she said, her voice a gentle rasp. "Got enough to ride it out?" "Affirmative," he replied, handing her a wad of cash. "You take care up there," she added, her gaze lingering on him for a beat too long. A man can get lost in all that quiet. He gave a curt nod, a dismissal that was not unkind, merely final. He gathered his supplies and walked back out into the biting wind. The snow had begun to fall, small hard pellets that stung his cheeks. He loaded the bags into the bed of his truck, his movements economical and swift. As he prepared to climb into the cab, he glanced back toward the woods. She was still there, same spot, same unwavering stare, fixed on his truck. It was not a look of aggression or fear. It was a look of profound, desperate appeal. A cold knot tightened in his gut. It felt like a signal, a distress call. He was conditioned to answer. He tried to ignore it. He started the engine, the old diesel rumbling to life. His mission was complete. The protocol was clear. Return to base, secure the perimeter, wait out the storm. But he could not take his eyes off the dog. Her gaze was a hook, and it had snagged on something deep inside him, something he thought had died in the dust of Kandahar. He remembered Rex, his intelligent eyes looking up at him, trusting him, even at the very end. The memory was a flash of heat, a breach in his defenses. He cursed under his breath, a low, guttural sound of frustration. The dog did not move. She just watched him, a silent sentinel against the encroaching storm. Then she did something that broke the stalemate. She took a hesitant step forward, then another. Before turning her head back toward the dark maw of the forest, she whined, a low, mournful sound that was nearly lost in the wind. She looked back at him, her eyes pleading. It was an invitation, a request. She was asking him to follow. He knew with a certainty that defied logic that she was not asking for herself. He cut the engine. The sudden silence was heavy, broken only by the whistling wind. For a long moment, Caleb sat motionless, his hands gripping the steering wheel. Every instinct, every rule he had built to survive his own life, screamed at him to drive away. This was not his mission. This was not his concern. Getting involved was a tactical error, an emotional entanglement he could not afford. But the image of her eyes, the echo of that desolate whine, had bypassed his training. It had struck at the man he used to be, the man who protected, the man who answered the call. Damn it, he muttered to the empty cab. He pulled a heavy-duty flashlight and a pair of gloves from his go-bag on the passenger seat. He slid a compact multi-tool into his pocket. Old habits, always be prepared. He stepped out of the truck, the cold hitting him like a physical blow. The German shepherd watched him approach, her body tense but not hostile. She held her ground until he was about 10 yards away. Then she turned and trotted into the trees, glancing back over her shoulder to ensure he was following. The internal winter was still raging, but for the first time in a long time, a different kind of storm was gathering on the horizon. A mission had been assigned. He followed her into the dense thicket of pines, the snow swirling around him, muffling the sounds of the world. The trees closed in, their snow-laden branches creating a dark, silent tunnel. The dog moved with purpose, her paws barely making a sound on the frozen ground. Caleb followed, his own steps measured and quiet, his senses on high alert. His training took over, his eyes scanning the terrain, his ears attuned to the slightest snap of a twig. He was no longer a man buying groceries. He was an operator on a recon mission. Moving into unknown territory, the air grew colder, the light dimmer. The scent of pine and wet earth was thick in his nostrils. She led him for several hundred yards deeper into the woods, away from the faint lights of the town. He could feel the barometric pressure dropping, the storm gathering its strength. They were running out of time. Finally she stopped beside a massive fallen oak, its roots ripped from the earth to form a shallow, cave-like structure. She whined again, a soft, urgent sound, and nudged her head toward the dark opening beneath the root ball. Caleb crouched down, clicking on his flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a scene that made the cold fortress around his heart crack. Huddled together in a shallow depression, lined with dry leaves, were 3 puppies. They were small, no more than a few weeks old. Shivering violently, two were curled into tight balls, their tiny bodies trembling. The third, a little male with a bold white patch on his chest, was trying feebly to nuzzle his way under his mother. They were a fragile knot of life in the face of the overwhelming cold. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. He saw their mother's ribs outlined starkly beneath her fur, the exhaustion and the slight tremor of her legs. She had spent every last ounce of her energy keeping them alive, and she was losing the battle. Mao. He understood the truth of her stare now. It was not for herself. She had been watching his truck, watching him, judging him. She had been searching for a rescuer. She had chosen him. The weight of that choice, that desperate maternal trust, settled on his shoulders. He switched off the flashlight, the darkness feeling more appropriate for the gravity of the moment. He could not leave them here. The storm would be their grave. The thought was not clinical or detached. It was a sharp, painful spike of emotion he had not allowed himself to feel in years. It was the feeling of responsibility. Caleb moved with a swift, calculated grace. "All right, girl," he whispered, his voice rough from disuse. "Let's get your team evacuated." He unzipped his heavy canvas jacket. The cold immediately bit into his skin, but he ignored it. He carefully laid the jacket on the ground, creating a makeshift carrier. The mother dog watched his every move, her body language a mixture of deep weariness and protective anxiety. He met her gaze, trying to project the calm he did not feel. "I'm not going to hurt them," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "I'm here to help." He reached into the nest, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle. He picked up the first puppy, a tiny, shivering female who whimpered softly. He placed her in the center of the jacket. Moved to the second, the bold one with the white chest, who tried to give his finger a defiant, toothless gumming. The third, a dark-coated male, was the most still, the most watchful. He reminded Caleb of a recon scout, observing, assessing. He gathered all three, their combined warmth a fragile spark against his cold fingers. The mother whined, a note of panic in her voice. "You're coming too," Caleb said, looking at her. He thought for a moment. He could not carry her and the puppies. He needed something else. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear. Sarah, on a fall hike years ago, wrapping her favorite cashmere scarf around the neck of a stray dog they had found, coaxing it back to their car. The scarf was still in the glove compartment of his truck. He had never been able to bring himself to remove it. It was a relic of a life that no longer existed. Now it had a purpose. But he rose to his feet. "Stay," he commanded the mother dog, his voice firm, using the same tone he had used with Rex. She seemed to understand. She laid her head on her paws, her eyes never leaving the precious bundle in his jacket. Caleb gathered the corners of his coat, creating a secure sling for the puppies, and began the trek back to the truck. The snow was falling faster now, a thick white curtain that reduced visibility to a few feet. He moved carefully, shielding the puppies with his body, their faint warmth a beacon against his chest. He reached the truck and gently placed the jacket and its contents on the passenger seat, turning the heat on full blast. He grabbed the scarf from the glove box. It was soft, the color of cranberries, and still held the faint, ghostly scent of Sarah's perfume. The grief hit him like a physical blow, sudden, staggering force. For a moment, he leaned against the truck, his eyes closed, the world tilting on its axis. He gripped the scarf tightly, the soft wool a connection to a world of warmth and love he had sealed away. But there was no time for this. The mission was not complete. He pushed the pain down, locking it back in its cage, and strode back into the woods. The mother was waiting, exactly where he had left her. She rose as he approached, a low growl rumbling in her chest. He stopped, holding out the scarf. "Easy, girl," he said softly. "This is for you." He looped the scarf gently around her neck, creating a makeshift leash. She flinched but did not resist. It was as if she knew this was part of the evacuation. He led her out of the woods, the bright cranberry color a stark slash against the monochrome world of the storm. Back at the truck, he opened the rear door of the extended cab, and she hopped in without hesitation, immediately turning to press her nose against the back of the passenger seat as close as she could get to her pups. Caleb got in, started the engine, and pulled out of the parking lot, leaving the silent town behind as the blizzard descended in full fury. The sterile order of his fortress had been breached. He had brought life and all its attendant chaos home with him. The drive back up the mountain was a battle. The wind howled, throwing sheets of snow across the road, and the truck skidded on patches of ice. Caleb drove with intense focus, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Inside the cab, a fragile ecosystem of warmth and life was forming. The puppies, revived by the truck's heater, had begun to stir and squeak, their tiny noises a stark contrast to the roar of the storm. Their mother watched them from the back, her panting breaths fogging the window. When they finally reached the cabin, the world was a maelstrom of white. He carried the puppies inside first, still bundled in his jacket, and placed them on the hearth near the cold wood stove. He then led their mother inside. She immediately went to her pups, licking them, nudging them, her tail giving a single, tentative wag. Caleb's cabin, his sanctuary of solitude, was instantly transformed. The air, once still and cold, was now filled with the scent of wet dog and the faint milky smell of the puppies. He got the fire going in the wood stove, the flames catching quickly and casting a warm, flickering light across the room. The sterile silence was broken by the soft whimpers of the pups and the crackle of the fire. It was chaos. It was life. It felt wrong. It felt threatening to the hard-won peace of his numbness. He stood in the middle of the room, feeling like an intruder in his own home. He was a soldier whose defensive perimeter had been overrun. He knew they needed food and water, the mother especially. He had no dog food. He opened a can of beef stew, picking out the pieces of meat and potato and placing them in a bowl. He set it on the floor with another bowl of fresh water. The mother dog drank thirstily, then tentatively ate the stew, her eyes darting between the bowl and her pups, as if she could not believe her luck. As she ate, Caleb examined the puppies more closely. They were small, but seemed healthy enough, their coats thick. The bold one, the little hero with the white chest, stumbled away from his siblings and tried to mount an expedition across the rough floorboards. He tripped over his own paws and tumbled onto his side with a soft yelp. Caleb felt the corner of his mouth twitch. It was the ghost of a smile, an involuntary muscular reaction he had not experienced in years. He immediately suppressed it. The other male, the quiet, watchful one, simply stared at Caleb from the safety of the bundle, his dark eyes seeming to hold a deep, ancient sorrow. Caleb felt a strange kinship with that one. He understood the instinct to observe from the shadows, to trust nothing. He decided to name them, not out of sentiment, but for tactical clarity. The bold one was Buddy, the watchful one was Shadow. The little female, who seemed the most content to simply sleep, was Willow. Their mother, the noble matriarch who had started it all, he simply called Mama. The storm raged for 2 days. Caleb was trapped, a prisoner with his new unruly charges. The rigid discipline of his life dissolved. His mornings were no longer about the precise splitting of wood, but about cleaning up puppy messes and ensuring Mama had enough to eat. His afternoons were not for silent contemplation, but for watching Buddy's clumsy attempts to play fight with a piece of kindling. The cabin became a den, a place of primal warmth and new life. He found himself talking to them, his voice low and gruff. "All right, Shadow, stop staring. It's just food. Buddy, that is not a chew toy. Drop it. Drop it." He was issuing commands, falling back on the familiar cadence of a handler, but the orders were for things like house training and play, not for sweeping a compound or detecting explosives. On the 3rd day, the storm broke, leaving behind a world of breathtaking silence, buried under 3 feet of pristine snow. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue. The peace was shattered by the sound of an approaching engine. Caleb's internal alarms went off. Visitors were rare. Unscheduled visitors were a threat. He looked out the window to see the county's animal control truck making its slow way up his unplowed driveway. A man in a thick uniform jacket stepped out. Deputy Miller, a by-the-book man, with a perpetually weary expression. Caleb met him on the porch, positioning himself to block the doorway. Mama stood behind him, a low growl vibrating in her chest. "Miller," Caleb said, his tone flat. "Caleb," the deputy replied, nodding. "Got a call from Martha, down at the general store. Age, you might have picked up some strays before the storm hit. Just doing a welfare check." Miller's eyes flickered past Caleb into the warm light of the cabin. He saw the puppies. His expression did not soften. "Well, I see you found them. That's the German Shepherd that's been spotted around for a few weeks." "They're fine," Caleb said. "I'm taking care of them." Miller sighed, a plume of white vapor escaping his lips. "You know the protocol, Caleb. I appreciate you getting them out of the storm. I really do. But they have to come down to the county shelter. They need to be checked for chips, vaccinated, evaluated. It's the law." The word shelter landed like a grenade in the quiet morning. Caleb knew about the county shelter. It was overcrowded, underfunded, and had a high kill rate. The thought of Mama and her pups in a concrete kennel, scared and alone, sent a surge of protective fury through him. It was an emotion so raw and powerful it took him by surprise. "No," he said, the word coming out as hard as frozen earth. Miller's eyebrows rose. "No, Caleb, it's not a request. They're unregistered animals. Legally, they have to be processed. They're not registered animals," Caleb countered, his voice dangerously low. "They're under my protection." The military language was instinctual, a shield. "Look," Miller said, his patience wearing thin. "I'm not the bad guy here. I'll give you 24 hours. Get them down to the shelter by noon tomorrow, or I have to come back and impound them. That's the best I can do." He looked at Caleb, a flicker of something like sympathy in his eyes. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." He turned and walked back to his truck, leaving Caleb standing in the cold, the ultimatum hanging in the air. The threat of separation was a declaration of war. Caleb spent the rest of the day fortifying his position. He called Anna, the town veterinarian, a woman he had met once when a deer had injured itself on his property. Her voice was calm and reassuring. "Bring them in, Caleb. Let's get them checked out and vaccinated. We can figure out the registration from there." It was a plan, a course of action. He felt the familiar comfort of having a mission objective. But as he prepared a makeshift crate for the puppies in the back of his truck, a deep sense of dread settled over him. The law was the law, and Miller was not the type to bend it. That evening, the cabin felt different. The warmth of the fire seemed fragile, the peace temporary. Mama was restless, pacing from the door to her puppies, whining softly. She could sense the threat, the impending disruption. Caleb sat on the floor, watching them. But he tumbled into his lap, falling asleep instantly. Willow curled up against his leg. Shadow, however, sat a few feet away, his dark eyes fixed on Caleb's face, as if asking the question Caleb could not answer. "Are you going to let them take us?" In that moment, the wall he had built around his heart did not just crack, it crumbled. These were not just dogs. They were his unit. They were his responsibility. He had failed to protect Sarah. He had failed to save Rex. He would not fail them. The decision was made. He would not take them to the shelter. He would fight. He would find a way. But as night fell, his resolve was tested in a way he never expected. Sometime in the deep, silent hours before dawn, he was awoken by a draft. The cabin door was ajar. He shot to his feet, his heart pounding. The spot by the hearth was empty. Mama and the puppies were gone. Panic, cold, and absolute seized him. He grabbed his flashlight and jacket, his mind racing. Mama must have gotten spooked. She must have sensed the danger and decided to run, to find a safer place for her children. She did not understand that the only safe place was here, with him, The only real danger was the wilderness she had fled back into. He burst out into the night. The temperature had plummeted. The world was bathed in the stark blue-white light of a full moon reflecting off the snow. He saw their tracks immediately, a clear trail leading away from the cabin toward the dense forest that bordered the back of his property. He began to run, following the prints, his boots sinking into the deep powder. The air burned in his lungs. His training screamed at him to slow down, to conserve energy. But the raw fear for the puppies overrode all logic. He was no longer a soldier. He was just a man, terrified of losing something precious again. He tracked them for what felt like miles, his flashlight beam cutting a frantic path through the darkness. The trail led him up a steep, wooded ridge. The air was thin up here, and an old shrapnel wound in his leg began to ache, a dull, throbbing reminder of a past failure. He pushed through the pain, his focus narrowed to the tracks in the snow. Finally he heard it, a high-pitched, desperate yelp. He scrambled toward the sound, his heart in his throat. The tracks ended at the edge of a deep ravine. It was a sharp, sudden drop of at least 30 feet, a scar in the landscape. Mama was at the edge, frantically digging at the snow, whining, her body trembling. Two of the puppies, Buddy and Willow, were huddled behind her, shivering. Caleb swept his light down into the ravine. His blood ran cold. There, on a narrow ledge about 10 feet down, was Shadow. The little puppy had clearly slipped and fallen, his fall broken by the outcrop of rock. He was perched precariously, unable to climb back up, with a sheer drop below him. He was crying, a thin, terrified sound that echoed in the vast, cold silence. Without a second's thought, Caleb began to act. There was no time for a plan, only for action. He had rope in his truck, but that was a mile away. Too long. He scanned the area. A thick, sturdy-looking pine grew near the edge of the ravine, its roots clinging to the frozen earth. It was his only anchor. He took off his thick canvas jacket and tore a long strip from the lining. It was not ideal, but it would have to do. He looped it around the base of the tree, testing its hold. It was flimsy. It would not support his full weight. He looked at Mama. Her eyes were locked on him, filled with a desperate, pleading trust. She knew she could not save her pup, but she believed he could. "Stay with them," he commanded her, his voice tight. He began to climb down, using the strip of cloth for minimal support, relying mostly on the strength of his hands and feet, finding purchase in the frozen rock face. The cold seeped through his shirt, leaching his warmth. His old injury screamed in protest. Every movement was a calculated risk. A slip would mean death for both him and the puppy. He reached the ledge. Shadow had stopped crying and was now pressed flat against the rock, shivering uncontrollably. "Easy, boy," Caleb whispered. "I've got you." He carefully scooped the puppy up, tucking him inside his shirt, against the warmth of his skin. The small body was ice cold. Now came the harder part, climbing back up with only one free hand. He could feel his muscles shaking from the cold and exertion. His grip on the frozen rock was slick. He looked up. The moonlit edge of the ravine seemed 100 miles away. He thought of Sarah. He thought of Rex. He thought of the promise he had made to himself in the dark. "Not again. I will not fail again." He found a new reserve of strength, fueled by pure, unadulterated will. He pulled himself up, inch by agonizing inch, the rough rocks scraping his knuckles raw. Shadow whimpered against his chest, a tiny, fragile heartbeat against his own. As he neared the top, his foot slipped on a patch of ice. For a heart-stopping second, he dangled by one hand, his body swinging out over the abyss. He gritted his teeth, the muscles in his arm and shoulders screaming as he fought to find a new foothold. He saw Mama's face peering over the edge, her eyes wide with terror. He would not let her watch another one of her family die. He kicked out his boot, finding a small crack, and hauled himself the rest of the way over the edge, collapsing onto the snow, gasping for air, the warm weight of the puppy safe inside his shirt. He lay there for a long moment, the world spinning. Mama was all over him, licking his face, nudging Shadow, her relief a palpable force. Buddy and Willow crawled over him, squeaking. He was surrounded by a wriggling, warm pile of life. And as he lay there, under the cold light of the moon, looking up at the indifferent stars, Caleb did something he had not done since the day he received the news about Sarah. He wept. Not loud, racking sobs, but silent, hot tears that froze on his cheeks. A quiet surrender to the overwhelming flood of grief and fear and a fierce, burning love. A crunch of snow behind him made him sit up, instantly alert. A figure was standing there, silhouetted against the moonlight. It was Deputy Miller. He held the flashlight, but it was pointed at the ground. "Saw your truck door open when I started my patrol," Miller said, his voice quiet. "Followed the tracks." He had seen everything. The fall, the climb, the rescue. Caleb braced himself for the lecture, for the official reprimand. He tucked Shadow more securely into his shirt, a protective gesture. But Miller did not move closer. He just stood there, watching the scene. He looked at the exhausted man, the grateful mother dog, the 3 puppies crawling all over their rescuer. He saw the raw knuckles, the torn shirt, the tear tracks on Caleb's face. "You know," Miller said, his voice softer than Caleb had ever heard it, "the county shelter has a foster program for special cases. Helps to socialize animals before adoption. We just need a local resident to volunteer to be the foster home. It's a lot of paperwork, though. Might take me a few days to file it. Maybe even until the end of the week." Caleb stared at him, understanding dawning. Miller was offering him a way out, a loophole, an act of mercy that went far beyond protocol. "Why?" Caleb asked, his voice hoarse. Miller looked away, toward the dark line of the mountains. "I had a dog once," he said simply. "Lost him in a house fire a few years back. Went in after him. Didn't make it." He cleared his throat. "Some things are more important than the rulebook. You should get them home before they freeze." He turned and walked away, his footsteps receding into the silent woods, leaving Caleb with his small, battered, and miraculously whole family. He carried Shadow and Willow and herded Mama and Buddy back to the cabin. The journey was slow, his body aching with a deep, satisfying exhaustion. Back inside the warmth of the cabin, he checked Shadow over. The puppy was cold and scared, but unharmed. Caleb sat on the floor, and for the first time, Shadow crawled into his lap without hesitation, curling into a tight ball and falling into a deep, trusting sleep. Caleb did not move for over an hour, content to just sit there, the weight of the puppy a warm, solid anchor in the shifting tides of his life. The next few days brought a new kind of thaw. Anna, the vet, came up to the cabin. She gave the dogs their shots and a clean bill of health, her gentle hands and kind eyes bringing a warmth to the cabin that had nothing to do with the fire. She saw the change in Caleb, the softening around his eyes, the way his hands rested protectively on Shadow's back. She did not comment on it, but her smile was genuine. "They're a beautiful family, Caleb," she said. "They're lucky to have found you." He just nodded, unable to articulate that he was the lucky one. Martha from the general store drove up in her ancient station wagon bearing gifts. 2 enormous bags of high-quality puppy food, old blankets, and a freshly baked apple pie. "Heard you had some new mouths to feed," she said, setting the pie on his table. "My son David. He was in the Marines. He always said the best part of coming home was his dog." She looked at Caleb, her eyes filled with a shared understanding of loss and the unique solace that came from a loyal animal. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the mission finds you." His cabin was no longer a fortress. It was a home. It was noisy and messy and filled with life. The silence had been replaced by the happy yaps of puppies at play, the thump of Mama's tail against the floorboards, the low murmur of conversation with Anna or Martha. The ghosts of Sarah and Rex were still there, but their presence was no longer a source of pain. It was a gentle memory, a foundation upon which this new, unexpected life was being built. He found he could think of Sarah's smile without the crushing weight of grief, and he could remember Rex's loyalty with a sense of pride instead of loss. One afternoon, the pale spring sun melted the last of the snow. Caleb sat on his porch, cleaning an old harmonica. It had been Sarah's. She had loved to hear him play his clumsy renditions of old folk songs. He had not touched it since she died. He brought it to his lips and blew a single, clear note. Buddy, ever the hero, immediately stopped chasing a butterfly and charged the porch, barking at the strange new sound. Willow peered out from under the steps, curious. Shadow, who was lying at Caleb's feet, lifted his head, looked at him with his soulful eyes, and then rested his chin back on Caleb's boot. A quiet acceptance. Caleb played a simple meandering tune, the notes floating out to the clean mountain air. He was not a great musician, but the music was alive, and it was his. He looked out at the vast expanse of the mountains, his 3 dogs and their noble mother resting peacefully around him. His sister Jessica had called that morning, and for the first time he had told her everything. He had heard the tears of relief in her voice. He had a new mission now. It was not one of discipline and solitude, of holding the line against emotion. It was a mission of care, of protection, of an open heart. The rescuer had been rescued. The internal winter had finally broken. In its place, against all odds, something new was beginning to grow.